going to have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll go with Bruce and then Fadzi and then Dujon. You can go, you'll pull us in. But Bruce, why don't you start 2 to 3 minutes, a little bit about yourself and what key point you want attendees to hear from you today. Kind of putting that on the front end so they already know.
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be with everyone. I'm Bruce Katz. I run a metro finance lab at Drexel University. In a prior life, I served in the federal government under Clinton and Obama and was at the Brookings Institution. I've spent the last year with my team at Drexel and partners all around the country, particularly a group called Accelerator for America that was co-founded by Eric Garcetti, the mayor of LA, focusing on the impact of this pandemic, the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on Black and Latino businesses, and the commercial corridors and main streets and business districts in which they tend to concentrate and co-locate. I just learned, I think yesterday, that a good colleague of mine and Drexel, so Blueprint Local, which is a group headed by Ross Baird, and the team at Drexel are receiving a grant from the EDA to explore new forms of financing for Black and Latino-owned businesses. As we all know, a lot of businesses are seeing their assets depleted, credit ruined. So we're going to be exploring over the next year, building off of work done by the Kauffman Foundation, their Capital Access Lab, new revenue-based financing models, profit-sharing models, and new investors that could come to the table. So I'm very interested as we go forward here on talking about, as we move towards all coming out of our basement, so to speak, can we begin to think about a different small business ecosystem writ large, but different forms of capital so that we can, quote unquote, build back better.
Different forms of capital. That is very contrary to let's get back to normal, because we know now that normal wasn't working. We need new forms of capital. Fadzi, how about you?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Fadzi. I am based in Perth, Australia. So I work as a diversity and inclusion consultant for various organizations across the world. I think for me, in terms of just the career and the work that I've done, I have really enjoyed the interaction. I think I've got a very cultured kind of background. Born in Zimbabwe, grew up in the States, lived in the UK, and now I'm in Australia. So I feel like those interactions and understanding different cultures and different things have enabled me to sort of like have an understanding, and also just the experience of always kind of feeling like I was on the fringes or the outskirts, and people not really understanding, what my background is as well. I think one of the things that I have been particularly focused on is really trying to get leaders to understand the importance of, the culture that they set within an organization. This work for me has been tiring, if I'm honest, but at the same time, I can see pockets of inspiration as well. And I think the important thing is for everyone to understand that every single person has a story and a uniqueness that they bring into any situation. And so it's just opening our minds to be able to accept that and affirm the experiences of others. I'm a proud mom to 2 boys. And yeah, that's me.
Fadzi, I think you even used the word tiring in your one word to describe this topic. Was it? Okay, great. I thought I'd recognize that. Dujon.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dujon Smith. I'm based in Chicago. I am the Midwest lead for Accenture Open Innovation, which basically means I have the fun and exciting job of connecting our Global 2000 clientele with startups in the ecosystem, which is just so much fun. I finally feel like I'm at a place in my career where my passions and my purpose are intersecting, which is great. I think it's a wonderful place for us as individuals to find that intersection point and operate out of that. Career has definitely spanned all over the place, backgrounds in finance and accounting, worked for Deloitte in London, worked for UK Parliament for a little bit, started LED manufacturers in Shanghai. I would say similar to Fadzi, I definitely have a unique collective cultural consciousness, first generation Jamaican American, but have spent the last decade living, working, and traveling in 50 countries. Across 6 continents. And I just think it's so amazing to experience different people, places, and cultures in a unique way, and bringing that mindset, I think, to corporate America has just been very interesting. I was talking to a founder the other day that has developed a really cool tool around DE&I, and just talking about, diversity is what we look like, equity is how we treat one another, and inclusion is why we stay. And in having those conversations, I think the main takeaway that I would want this group to think about is, it's more than just having, the simple implicit bias trainings. It's like, how are we investing in the right tools to track these efforts across the organization to make sure that we're creating a space where everyone feels valued, heard, and respected. But that's me in a nutshell. Just celebrating my birthday. I'm a St. Patrick's Day baby. So happy to be here this evening with all of you to talk about this topic that I think is very challenging. That's the word that I used in the chat earlier, but it can be exciting when we get it right.
Well, I, as a person who also was a frequent traveler quite a bit prior to COVID happening, I'm sure you could, I sympathize with you, the screeching halt that we all experienced from being able to go to different cultures, different cities, different communities, and then all of a sudden that stops, and then trying to still have that infusion of culture through Zoom. What a challenge. Just briefly, as your moderator, I'm Travis Sheridan. I work for a company called Wexford Science and Technology, and I'm their Chief Community Officer. Been with the company for just over a year now. Really, my area of focus is, as we are building these innovation districts, or knowledge communities as we call them, let's do it in a way where they are built through a lens of inclusion and equity. And really the way that I often think about that is the neighborhoods that are directly adjacent to these innovation districts are often filled with young brown and black brothers and sisters, and can they see themselves working in these shiny buildings that we are building? And if they can't, how do we change that? And if they can, how do we make that a reality? I mean, that's really what drives me every single day. And some of the exciting work that we're doing right now is modifying the City University of New York's equity indicators and applying that to innovation districts so that we can measure the level of equity and inclusion with a dashboard and hold ourselves and really this sector accountable. So the way this is gonna go, we're gonna have a conversation. Won't be too rigid. If you don't feel like you need to answer, don't answer. I always say best answers are longer than 20 seconds, shorter than 2 minutes. That's a healthy window right there. If you go a little longer, I'm not going to cut you off. I have the power of the mute button. I never use it. But I will ask Dujon, because you are with Accenture and you work really closely with some of the corporates, I'm going to ask you to start with this one, and then really anybody else can answer as well. So many companies, and we saw this after Memorial Day in the United States last year, after that weekend when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. A lot of companies went forward with a lot of wonderful intentions. Everybody got their statement written and published to their website as quickly as possible. But those intentions often fall short when it comes to execution. And the other reason I wanted to call on you is Accenture is a consulting company. Like, they help people execute in very specific ways. What do you think are different about the DEI efforts this time around? I mean, I do feel like this time it is a little bit different. Agree or disagree, and what might make it different?
No, I agree. I think right now, due to the pandemic and everything that's happened, that has really put a lot of these topics to the forefront of conversations, because so many things that we've had in our daily lives have been distractions. Those have been stripped away. So we've really had to, as a society, get real with one another to say, like, this is the stuff that's going on. And I think just the momentum that, Black Lives Matter movement and other movements and social issues that have been happening over the last several months have just been accelerated so much, because there was just basically nothing else happening in the world, because we were forced to just sit still and to have these tough conversations. So I think a combination of obviously the pandemic and the stripping of the distractions and us having real hard conversations about what are we going to do, how are we going to move this thing forward, has just been the forefront for so many of our own clients and even ourselves, Accenture, I would say, we chose a specific area that we wanted to go deep in. Obviously, we have our D&I goals of, from a gender perspective, from an ethnic perspective, and that is different in various countries, whether it's the UK, South Africa, the United States, but here, at least in North America, and in my team specifically, we focused on, hey, we want to elevate Black founders in North America, because we see the data, we see that, less than 2% of VC funds are going to Black founders. So what can Accenture do? We're going to put the statement out, September 2020, and actually follow through and execute. And we've developed our own Black Founders Fund that's specific around, putting strategic minority investments within the community, building community, and developing thought leadership on why Black and brown founders should be getting into the enterprise tech space. So I think one thing that has been good is that, most of these organizations are finding their niche area where they can double down and know that they can execute on, and focusing on those areas outside of just putting out some blanket statements. I think now more than ever, because these statements are out there, there are so many people, not only just within the organizations, but shareholders that are seeing these and are holding these companies accountable and saying, "Hey, you put this out there. It's been 7 months. What's happening?" At the time is ticking. So I think because this information has been put out there now, much more than ever, there's so many other stakeholders and people that are watching these statements and making sure that they're actually coming to fruition.
Yeah. Others, what makes you feel like it might be different this time?
Well, I could take, Fadzi, would you like to go first?
Go ahead, Bruce.
So I think there's a difference, Travis, between, the national or global companies and what they're committing to. Those are like the law of big numbers. JP says 30 billion, Goldman says 20 billion. We have 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. So I tend to focus more on the local, the city and the metropolitan, because in that case, I think what's happening are consortia of companies are coming together, usually through kinds of business leadership organizations or initiatives like the Philly Anchor for Growth and Equity or the Chicago Anchor for Strong Economy. And when you go local, where the rubber hits the road, it tends to be more of an ecosystem focus. What's the relationship of supplier diversity to capital, to entrepreneurial support? So it just gets a hell of a lot more real at the local level than at the national or global level. So I think that's where I feel there's a level of commitment that's authentic, and that is grounded in real places. And I think those are the initiatives to watch, because that's where the reckoning is really, really happening.
Fadzi?
I was going to say, my experience last year, why I feel like the conversation has shifted is I just think we started getting allies on board. I think, if we think about, racial equity and, the things that have been happening, even if we look at it from a purely American context, and if we think about the murders of, George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, those things were not new in the sense that, Black men have been killed for a long time in that context. But I started hearing voices, particularly of white people that had been silent for a long time, starting to stand up and say something. And then I think that changed, the landscape in a couple of areas, because, something that had been happening for a long time, there was now, light was shed on it, and people started responding. And in an Australian context, I started to see a lot of the white colleagues who had been silent, who I'd been, asking for a long time in terms of issues, any disparity, to say something, found their voice, and for whatever reason, and I think that there was a shift that was starting to happen, and you started to see organizations now getting behind it. And so we started to see a lot of organizations making a stand, whereas before in diversity and inclusion work, particularly my experience, you often hear organizations saying, we don't want to get involved, we're for everybody, we don't want to align with one specific thing. And then last year, I think there was this movement. And I would describe, the shift as saying, in my experience, when I think back to 2020, I always say it brought out the best and the worst in humanity. There were aspects of last year that you just love humans and you think this is amazing. And then there are other aspects where you're just like, why am I a human? And so it was one of those areas. But I do think that, there was a lot of things, we had the pandemic, people were at home, and it gave you a lot of opportunity to actually reflect on yourself personally. What are the things that you've been engaged in? Are you talking to the right people? What are you allowing? So we all came into a period of reflection, and the two sort of happened. And I think the pandemic was an equalizer because it wasn't, obviously there's disparities in terms of, marginalized groups experiencing from a health perspective. But in terms of COVID just hitting everyone, rich, poor, whatever nation, I think that was an equalizer in the sense that we were all impacted by that. And then, coupled with what we're seeing in the D&I landscape, you started to see people who had just been quiet starting to speak up. But I think that in my perspective, I would love to see the same tenacity, the same consistency when it comes to things that impact people, that it shouldn't be just when, it impacts my little corner or if my organization is impacted. But it's about, we need to create a just world, because even in an organization isn't an island. And so if you can create a healthy culture within your organization, that impacts on everybody else around you as well.
It's interesting you mentioned the pandemic. I've heard a number of people, because of COVID hitting and it being such a global phenomenon, also recognizing that racially based inequities is another pandemic. Like racism and systemic racism is a pandemic. And so by having this lens at which to look at and treat and respond to with COVID, we can use that. We can start making some parallels and start addressing racism in the same way, which, like you said, Fadzi, it's like they're both happening at the same time. So then we get to respond to them at the same time. Tracy made a comment in the chat box that I wanted to pull out here as well. And that is, COVID also forced us into rapid change. I always say, there's probably been a list of things that people have wanted to implement that are quote unquote innovations. Like schools have said, we should try distance learning one of these days, or remote learning. And medical profession, healthcare is like, we should really lean into telemedicine one of these days, right? And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and we're forced into those. Maybe addressing racism and inequities is that same type of thing, right? We're like, we'll get around to it eventually. And then we run out of these excuses. We're like, well, I'm not going on vacation this week, so I guess I will go protest instead. Like we've run out of these things. But there's, Fadzi, you mentioned allyship, and I want to talk a little bit about, getting people into companies and talking about the right cultures that companies need to set up so that, I often say that an invitation is one thing, access is something entirely different. Do I feel like I belong here? But what are some ways that we can create pathways for allies, right? Let's not think about employees or growing our companies, but in order for the efforts like this to be successful, we do need to onboard more allies to this type of effort. Any thoughts on what we could do organizationally or as, even as individuals to bring more allies into this conversation?
I think that, I believe that leaders have an important role to play in terms of creating an environment where there's allies. And I think first of all, it's about recognizing our stories and other people's stories. So, to be a real champion of an inclusive environment means that I have to be willing to listen more and to understand the perspectives and the viewpoints of different people. And I think when we talk about allyship needs to be active, you know. So if I think about Ibram Kendi, when he talks about that, it's like, you know, what concrete steps are you taking to create that kind of environment? And I think that it can be as simple as listening more. I think it's also about acknowledging and affirming the experiences of people, and recognizing that our lived experience is definitely different. But I think that it's about allowing, you know, everyone the opportunity to express whatever opinions they are. And I think it's also creating a safe environment. As an active ally, I am, you know, showing you that I'm willing to stand alongside you. I am, you know, affirming your experiences, and I'm doing it not because it makes me look good, but because, you know, I want to be on the journey. So I think it also requires commitment and being in it in the long term. But a lot of that is about, you know, education. And we often put the burden of educating the majority on the minority. So it becomes the marginalized group's responsibility to educate. And I think if you're going to be an active ally, you need to educate yourself and not re-traumatize somebody by always asking them for their experience and not making it about you. It is about the other person. So I think it's you know, taking a stand where it's not about being selfish, but it's really about, you know, what does this person need to feel safe in this environment? What do they need from me? And I think it's about a willingness to be able to do that as well.
Great. Other thoughts from folks on, you know, how do we onboard more allies?
Yeah, I would probably just add a quick point in there as well, as we kind of distinguish ally and accomplice. I think all accomplices are allies, but not all allies are accomplices. And basically allies, yes, is standing there, you know, hearing your voice and, you know, standing in solidarity with you, but that accomplice is taking it a step further and adding risk in there as well. It's like, how do I use my power and my privilege to really maybe even risk my own well-being and my own physical safety to ensure that you have a better situation, because I know you're in a space that's not really good. So I think there's definitely a conversation there, to Fadzi's point around obviously the education, the awareness, but yes, having allies is great, but then how do we move some of our allies to truly be accomplices and using their power and privilege to make the other marginalized voices, to create a community in a space for marginalized voices are, you know, amplified even more, and providing them some sort of equitable space. So I think that's a conversation that also needs to be had and talked about when we're speaking on allyship.
Travis, just to build on that, we've had real-time experience the last year with the deployment of the Paycheck Protection Program in the United States. As the lockdowns began to roll out, a lot of very small, undercapitalized Black and brown businesses that did not have the friendly banker realized that they were not in line to get this exceptional amount of federal relief. And so a bunch of places basically responded by giving them the financial navigation and guidance and help with documentation and paperwork they needed, and then helping them link to banks or community development finance institutions or community bankers or even fintech firms. And so I think a whole bunch of places in the US found out, do we have any networks really that can be activated in the crisis? Or do we have to build new ones? In Philadelphia, we're very lucky because we have the Enterprise Center not far from where the Innovation District is. It's like 36th and Market. And, so they were able to activate a network. But frankly, in most parts of the US, it's basically the mid-tier firms, 250 workers or more, employees or more, are the ones who got the first Paycheck Protection Program. So a lot of talk over the last year. And I think in some places, action because they had the infrastructure in place. In other places, they're still struggling to figure out how to build it. So I think this is going to test the system. I am hopeful, but I think we're really going to see a testing over the course of the next year.
Well, as we talked about onboarding allies, the other part of this is how do we onboard more employees so that there's representation within companies. I work in commercial real estate. There are, in the firm I work for is very progressive. There are 3 African Americans. Or if I'm doing, going based on my ancestry.com, there are 2.5 African Americans in our company. But there's just not a lot of pipeline there. And I always say that pipeline is an excuse because the talent is there, but you have to go look for it. But even if you do bring in, Black and brown, LGBTQ, more women in a male-dominated industry, the sense of belonging and acceptance is different than just getting them in the door. What are some strategies that you've seen or deployed that help in the area of belonging and ensuring that when you are bringing in different voices that they do fit within, or that they don't, if they don't fit within, they don't fit within in the right way, right? Like they are bringing something additive that was missing in the past.
Let me just say one thing. It's just, this is like the pre-employment piece. If we don't start doing apprenticeships at scale and really bringing in, whether it's high schools, community colleges, really start bringing in a steady stream as a matter of course and convention, then these kinds of friction is going to continue. So I really think that part of this is not about just the employment base today, it's the employment base tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because all these cities are dealing with, in West Philadelphia, walk 10 blocks. You're dealing with, proximity to high poverty neighborhoods where none of the kids in those schools are exposed to the kind of innovation that's occurring as a matter of course, in the universities and the hospitals and the companies. And so this is really where I think we need to build the pipeline, but it has to start very early, or else, we're not gonna have the kind of impact we want.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would add to that in terms of, these entry-level pathways and making sure that, we are diversifying the ways in which people can enter the workplace. But I was doing some work with a mining organization, and they wanted to increase their, gender targets. And so for entry-level positions. And so they had like a 50-50 kind of, intake from that level in terms of bringing people in, but the culture within that environment was not very conducive for a lot of females to come in. And so what started happening is, people started dropping off. A lot of the female employees just felt like the environment was quite toxic. And so I think that every strategy that we put, whether it's an entry-level pathway program, whether it's a pipeline, in terms of creating a sense of belonging, we have to think about, what is it that we're wanting? So I think there's a lot of confusion when we think about diversity, when we think about inclusion, when we think about equity, and then when we think about, belonging. And I always give the analogy of baking a cake, which everyone, kind of knows. But for me, the ingredients are the diversity, and diversity is never the destination. So we have to get that right, even when we're thinking about how do we create a sense of belonging. Diversity is not the destination. It is not just enough for us to say, well, we've got a few females, we've got a few Black folk, where are the LGBTI people? Let's throw in a few indigenous while we're at it, kind of thing. That is not the destination. Diversity is just the first step. And then from that, the mixing of all these ingredients, that's the inclusion bit, right? That's like, how do we get everyone to come together? How do we tap into their potential? The belonging bit for me is the cake itself. This is the end product. This is where we want to get to. We want our organization to create a sense of belonging. But the problem, what we have is we often argue and we have diversity hierarchies where it's like, this is more important than the other. And if you think, going with my analogy of baking a cake, if you think about those ingredients, it then begs this whole question about equality and equity. Equality would say that we treat the ingredients the same, but we can't put butter or fresh milk in a pantry. Particularly, I'm in Perth on a Perth summer day because it's going to melt and it's going to go off. So we put those things in the fridge. Does it mean that the milk or the butter is more important than the flour? Absolutely not. But we recognize that those ingredients just have, particular characteristics and they need to be put in the fridge. That's the equity for me. It's recognizing, okay, we've got to put this ingredient here, but it's not to say any, ingredient is more important. And what we've seen in our culture is we have seen where, whether it's people in positions of power championing, a certain cause, and then, other groups feeling marginalized, and then, creating a sense of belonging won't exist when certain members feel like this is not the culture for me, or there's no voice. And, we often talk about having a seat at the table. And, when Dujon was talking about power and privilege, those are real important things to consider when we're talking about creating a sense of belonging and what that looks like. Because, as it's been said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think we've eaten far too many groups in the process of trying to create this sense of belonging. Or we say, okay, we'll invite you to the table, but you don't talk, just watch and observe what we do. Again, that's not creating a sense of belonging. So I think there has to be intention behind anything that we do in terms of, first of all, why do we want, the diversity? Okay, we want the diversity. The business case is there. We know that there's added benefits. We know about innovation. We know about increased productivity. We know about all of that. And then the next bit is, how will those voices now shape and contribute to a culture that we want to set? So I think we've got to be very clear about, all of these buzzwords and put some intention around what we're trying to create. Because at the end of the day, people are our greatest asset, and any organization or any leader needs to make sure that it's all people and not just a few people. And so this is, for me, one of the biggest blockages is people not even understanding, what are we talking about when we say diversity, inclusion? What are we talking about when we talk about equality or equity and all? So I think that understanding has to be there from the beginning.
I really appreciate what you said about the table. I've not on a DEI through lens, but I've worked with a number of nonprofits that have wanted to get a younger generation serving on the boards. And so they'll create a junior boards of, and I always think of that as the, at least in the United States, it's like the kids table at Thanksgiving. You're not recognizing the talent that young people have of actually sitting at the adult table and providing content and value. And then if they are invited to the quote unquote adult table, and they're, Gen Z or Gen Z for my Australian friends, then they're thought of as being the ones that oversee social media. Like they're putting these little tiny pigeonholes based on their age and not necessarily what overall they can contribute. And we will talk about leadership in a couple of moments. But Fadzi, you are right. It's about getting the right language, using the right language, the right nomenclature, and clarifying that. But also the intentionality. Dujon, did you want to add anything as it relates to onboarding employees or bringing folks in?
Yeah, no, definitely. And Fadzi, great cake metaphor that really painted a great picture, and it's making me want to get another slice of my cake after this. Yes, I think as Bruce was talking earlier about the apprenticeship and having programs like that, I think that high school pipeline is key in building, the workforce of the future. And definitely at Accenture, we've really been working with various cities on things like that. And, finding people of what they would say non-traditional backgrounds from four-year institutions and finding places to say, hey, these skills are transferable no matter where you are and who you are. Let's get you in now. Let's get in the pipeline and make sure that the organization is just aware of this and saying, hey, look, all of these people bring unique talents and gifts that just helps us to be a better company at the end of the day. And then I would say too, even just the language, I think to Fadzi's point around when we were looking at gender and making sure that we had more women applying to some of our technology and data scientist roles, just even the language, changing the language, we've seen, you know, an uptick in the number of female applicants for certain jobs. So just looking at how language with regards to job descriptions, how internally we match people with projects from consulting and stuff like that, I think has been key to ensure that there's not this continued you know, white boys club, as we've said in the past, to be transparent and honest with you all, you know, trying to moving away from that narrative to say, hey, yes, this is definitely an inclusive space. But then, you know, not forgetting, because oftentimes we'll talk about Black, Indigenous people of color, we talk about women, but also talking about veterans, talking about people with disabilities, which is another area that we really need to hone in on. With regards to making sure that we have an accessible space for all. I think obviously this time over the last year, everyone working remotely, like, do we all have the right digital capabilities? But then also when we're in the office, you know, are all people being taken of and heard, and not, to Fadzi's point, like this hierarchy. Like right now we're just focused on women, and tomorrow we're focused on Black and brown folks. Maybe we'll talk about veterans another day, and then people with disabilities another. It's like, how is this all inclusive all at once? And to Fadzi's point, how are we making sure that we're using the right language and setting the right intentions up front so that everything is communicated in the right manner?
Well, Bruce mentioned education, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the Science Center and their firsthand program of getting, especially a lot of the kids from the surrounding neighborhoods there in West Philly, involved and interested in the sciences and the STEM disciplines. Y'all are doing a good job, and we know that that's a long game, right? We're getting kids interested when employers have needs now, but they also will have needs in 15 years or so. And so helping prime the pump and get kids introduced to those career fields. We have about 20 minutes left or so, and so I have a couple more questions and we'll open up for the broader group. I've talked to a few leaders who seem paralyzed to the point of inaction because they're worried about getting it wrong, right? There's the number of times you have to go through a revision just to put a equity statement on your website. Now that the need to actually move from statements to actions, cause some fear. But there is a role for vulnerability and transparency in rolling out these types of efforts so that they are authentic. What role do things like vulnerability, transparency, willingness to get it wrong, open to the listening, as many of you mentioned, what roles do those play, and that leaders can really, you know, take and put into practice so they aren't just paralyzed?
In my opinion, I think that's really important. I think vulnerability is a strength. And I think for far too long, we've looked at it as a weakness, particularly when we think about leadership and stuff. So I think that it's important for people to, you know, to be able to share their experiences and their different pathways, because that is how it helps other people. And, you know, if I think about the pandemic and I think about what happened last year, I think, you know, we were all vulnerable, you know, and I think that people have an understanding that we can be vulnerable in, you know, in different situations. But I think that, you know, to fear, no one ever gets it right, because, you know, let's be honest, when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about attitude and behavior, you know, and so that is at an individual level. And so, you know, people's attitudes and behaviors are constantly different. And if we fear, and this is the interesting thing for me, because we often talk about great leadership as, you know, people who are not afraid to take risks, leaders who are able to, you know, take the risks and wear the, you know, the consequences of that risk. But when it comes to human behavior, when it comes to interactions with people, which is something that we've been doing from the time we're born, all of a sudden we become scared and we become paralyzed. And I often, you know, tell my boys, you know, whenever we're having these kind of discussions, is that, you know, with siblings, you don't love each other every single day. Sometimes you piss each other off and you hate each other for a moment, but then you come back and you're like, well, you know, this is my brother, or this is my sister, etc. And I think that any relationship that deals with humans will have bad and off days. But I think a leader who is committed to the journey and is open enough to say, I might not get it right, but I'm at least willing to try. You know, just think about, you know, riding a bike. for the first time. You're going to fall off, but you continue doing it until you get it right. And so I think there's nothing wrong in fearing that, but you know, you will make mistakes, and that is okay. Everybody makes mistakes. You just keep at it until you get the language and the culture right. But I think what it shows me when I see a vulnerable leader, somebody who's willing to take a risk and is authentic, I see that as a sign of somebody who's trying to do something and open enough to say, okay, I might make mistakes, but I'm willing to participate in the journey. So I just say, you know, like the Nike slogan, just do it, just continue to do it. And not be scared, because you will get a result, but it will enable people to actually come in and also offer opinion, you know, and then you can create something from that. I have great respect for leaders who are vulnerable, who are open enough to tell me about their journey in terms of even how they got to specific places, and not acting like, you know, they woke up and they were born into this. I really find that I can understand people and I can relate to their story when they're telling me the journey. And I think that would be the same in a D&I perspective, because fundamentally D&I is just about how we engage with each other, you know, just on a basic level.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned, you know, the transparency. One of the reasons I'm putting together this dashboard to really measure, and a report card to measure the level of equity and inclusion within our innovation districts, is so that we can be transparent about it. And, you know, the fact of the matter is our report cards won't always be straight A's. And that's okay. Right. Like we have to be okay with that. Other folks want to talk about overcoming the paralysis, moving toward being able to be more vulnerable and transparent in these efforts.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability is definitely key. You just got to put it out there. And I think for leaders to take a startup mindset to all of this as well. Sometimes you just need to fast fail. You need to iterate. You need to learn, test, grow, and just if you keep that same mindset that we do with launching new products and services, you never get it right. To Fadzi's point, the first time. You got to just put something out there, test it, see how the consumers react to it, and then take those learnings and then keep moving it forward. I think the same thing with D&I. Obviously, we want it to be perfect and we want to get it right 100% the first time, but that's never going to happen. And to your point around, you know, being paralyzed to just not do anything at all, like, all right, let's just push this away. We shouldn't do that. I think we should definitely take a book, you know, out of this startup mindset and just fast fail to learn, iterate, and be quick. And then, you know, just falling in love with that process and that journey. I think oftentimes we love to see just the finished end product, but there's so much beauty, there's so much learning, there's so much hope in just seeing how you have taken your organization from one place to another in the future, and just the learnings that not only your organization can have, but other organizations can have just by seeing and learning your journey and then just sharing that knowledge. I think the more transparency we have in our organizations, not only just internally, but then externally, because everyone is dealing with this issue at the end of the day. And I think as more leaders are transparent to say, hey, look, this is how I'm doing over here in my house. What's working over here? Like, how do you keep your kids in line? You know, I think we just need to be more transparent there and sharing that knowledge, because then we can all just get that much further with regards to creating space for everyone, you know, to feel that value, that respect, and feeling that they have a voice.
Travis, I do most of my work in mid-tier cities in the Midwest, Heartland, Southeast, et cetera. I have to say, you know, having been engaged with many corporate executives over the past several years, they're almost just confused and frustrated by this moment where they're willing to make commitments, and they find that there's like very few best practices, and I want to focus mostly on supplier diversity, very few intermediaries, no data, no proven models. So they're used to a certain way of operating where, you know, if you have challenge A, challenge B, challenge C, there's a whole host of players around the country or in your own, you know, city or metro who know how to help you.
Like you could Six Sigma your way out of this.
No, exactly. And then they're in this new world of like, what do you mean that no one is like a best practice in the United States or elsewhere? It's, I have to say that there's a desire to do things and a frustration that how the hell did we get to this point? I mean, you know, so we've got a lot of building up of really new intermediaries, practices, models. I mean, we're sort of like at a training wheel kind of moment here. I'm really, you know.
Well, I think supplier diversity and procurement programs are one of those areas that we're seeing roll out more and more, where there are challenges on both sides of the equation, right? There are companies that are wanting to spend their money with more purpose and intention. Yet there are minority and women-owned businesses that may not have the capacity in which to execute.
Totally.
And so there needs to be, it is a training issue. How do we close that gap? Because we have the willing dollars to be spent, and we just need to continue to build the capacity for those that can execute on that. Are there other areas like that, like supplier diversity and procurement, where, I mean, that's defined. We can do that. Like, we can train for that. Are there other areas like that?
Well, it's a shift from a legalistic mindset or a check the box mindset to a market making mindset. I mean, it's a radical paradigmatic shift. And it is not like, oh, well, we tried, we couldn't find anyone. No, you need to do this. You know? So it's a moral obligation as opposed to a legal requirement. And I think that's a mindset shift that I think is happening, but we're going to go through a very experimental, innovative phase here, to be frank.
Well, and to Dujon's point, then maybe that is that startup mindset. Like, we do need to experiment. We need to iterate, learn from those. Anytime I'd like to think that anytime a company pivots, it's an informed pivot. And I see John's mentioning some work that he was a part of with, I think, Johnson & Johnson. Sometimes they do turn into a PR activity than something meaningful.
Yeah, and if I can comment just quick on it.
Sure, yeah, please, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. It became more of a PR play where the goal would trickle down to kind of the my level, and we would have to make sure that the IT organization was spending enough money with SHI, which was I probably shouldn't say names, but with an organization that was a reseller of IT hardware that was 51% woman-owned, because it was about $150 million of that billion-dollar roundtable. And if we didn't hit that $150 million goal, then they'd fall off the billion-dollar roundtable. So it's kind of, the intention was there, but, is the impact really what you want it to be?
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I do see that's part of, I think there's always the skeptic in me that wonders, is this a PR activity for companies? And there are going to be those that will do this for PR purposes. I think it's hard to fight that. But I do think that if we continue the conversation, and to Dujon's point, that many companies put out the statements, and now people are starting to hold those companies accountable and circling back. In fact, I know of a few different Black organizations that scrubbed the web, right, and put a crawler out and pulled every corporate statement out so that they can go back 12 months later and do an accountability exercise. As we're wrapping up, I have one more question here, and then we'll open up for the last couple of minutes of questions from anybody else that might have them, or final statements. What are some things that leaders can do? We mentioned the procurement programs. We mentioned bringing people to the table. But how can leaders, if we need them to listen to different voices, how can we put them in the right place to hear those different voices? Somebody said in the comment section that DEI councils, and oftentimes it's the junior people in the organization that are assigned to or given the opportunity to go to be part of these outside organizations. And so that message never really gets back to the top. What are some things that leaders can do to be meaningful and purposeful in listening and being better at at this area?
I have worked for different companies, and the organizations where there were junior staff, in terms even where diversity is pitched, haven't really been successful in terms of the council. So I do think that you know, if you're setting up a council or, you know, have employee network groups, you have to ensure that there's the right amount of influence attached to the role. So I think that one of the things that leaders can do is to ensure that you know, anyone responsible for D&I work is able to influence at the top level and give them the resources to be able to do it. Because often organizations might have, you know, someone there, or they might have a particular program, but the resources to enable, you know, a person to actually do anything aren't there. And then it becomes this constant fight of budget and getting, you know, things. And I think that if it's pitched at the right level, you'll have the best results. So I think a leader who's serious about D&I is going to pitch it at that level where there's an ability to influence. And that's something that they have to do. And it can't be the responsibility of anybody else. It has to be well-resourced, and it has to be able to influence and even challenge, you know, some decisions. So I know for me personally, where that has worked well. So recently with an organization, I set up employee network groups, but the chairs of those employee network groups were also on the diversity committee that was chaired by the CEO. And then all the other executives sponsored an employee network group to create that visibility, to ensure that leadership was championing it. And then people were able to see, plus they added resources to that so that people were able to do things. And that I've seen work well. But it took the CEO, you know, to say that this is important, not only to myself, but to our business. Like, diversity has to be embedded in everything we do. And so when that happens, you start to see the results. So I think that for any leader thinking about it who might be listening, I would say, where are you pitching it? You know, have you attached resources? Does it even have influence, or is it buried under hierarchy? Because if someone is buried under hierarchy and they need 5 people to approve something, then to me, that tells me the organization doesn't take D&I seriously.
Mm-hmm. Other folks?
Yeah, I would just say data, metrics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, David just put up dashboards. I mean, these companies live or die by information. If you don't measure this stuff in real ways, if you don't know your baseline, you can't set goals, you can't keep people accountable. I mean, that has to become the culture, you know. And right now, it's my sense is it's du jour, it's the moment. I mean, we're all going to now commit to this because it's you know, a collective action, you know, in many of these cities. But if you within your own company don't have the baseline information, set aspirational goals, and then stick to it, you know, that's the big question for me: is can we persist on this?
Dujon, did you want to add anything? Oh, go ahead, Fadzi, go ahead, and then Dujon, you could wrap that one up.
I just wanted to add that even when we have the data, data can tell any story you want it to. Mm-hmm. You know, you can create a story with data. So let's be clear that I think it's really important, particularly bringing people who are not on board, but data must tell the proper story. And so we shouldn't hide it and only take the data that we want. So I think that it's about, you know, being clear that if we're going to go down that route, we have to show it all, the good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. Dujon?
Definitely, I would say, yeah, data is definitely key. I saw a great startup called Cape Inclusion that's really working to help organizations find the right data and telling all the stories, as Fadzi was saying, the good, bad, and the ugly. But with regards to, I think, a point that she was making earlier, I've been seeing it very successful when it's coming from the business and not just from HR as a function, because when the business is bought in, they're the ones who are definitely putting in the resources to say, hey, look, this is a priority for our business unit, for our service line. How can we leverage HR and the best practice that they have and the expertise that they have in this space? But we are bought in because we know that this is going to contribute to our bottom line. So I've been seeing it very effective, not with just, you know, our HR leads and our diversity and inclusion leads saying, hey, yeah, we should do this stuff. And this is what we're trying to do in the marketplace. And as an organization, I've just seen it truly effective, and even at Accenture, when our business unit and those leaders and those service line folks are bought in and pushing it down, and really putting the funding and the people and the man-women power behind it to really drive it forward. Because yeah, when it's just coming from HR and HR alone, that I haven't seen the full traction and trickle down throughout the whole organization as I have when it's been the actual true business unit leaders within organizations pushing it forward.
Yeah, John asked a question, and Fadzi referenced it in her answer. It's this idea of, do DEI programs need to exist in a silo, or should they cut horizontally through purchasing, HR, business unit, operations, and really look at it horizontally? Fadzi, it sounded like you were saying it should be much more of a horizontal approach so that it does have a clear lens. But does that give people a cop-out? I mean, does that dilute it a little bit? Or is it more of a both and, where you need this, focused counsel and effort plus a cross-section that goes across the organization?
I think if it's embedded within the organization, then, when you get to that maturity level, you can then question, whether you need a counsel. But, in my experience, there aren't a lot of councils that operate in a system where it is decentralized. And what I mean by that is it's not in HR, it's embedded throughout the organization. And that's going to take time to build that culture. But I certainly agree that D&I should be in purchasing. Should the way I describe it, I always say to people, if you have a D&I person and you want to make sure that it is embedded, that person should be able to sit within any function of your business and still be able to do the work, because it is seen as imperative to whatever function we're talking about. And that also creates the need for that will happen when people have a greater understanding of what it is, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of a D&I person. I totally agree, because we often put the burden on, diversity inclusion on the person who has the title, and they should just be advising and doing the strategic stuff. Every single person has the responsibility for creating an inclusive environment. That is something that we should be pushing people to understand.
I'm going to hit this last question that came in from Facebook Live, because I have seen some real world examples of this, and this will be our wrap up question, because this is also very tactical. Can you speak to how we can better craft job description and internship positions to attract more diverse candidates, or ways to put them out in the world so that they know that those opportunities exist? I will mention one. I know that the University of Maryland at Baltimore re-rated a bunch of their jobs and moved from jobs requiring a 4-year degree to not necessarily requiring a 4-year degree. Instantly opened up 1,600 positions that formerly required a 4-year degree. And the other example I would give is paid internships. If anybody ever posts an unpaid internship again and I see it, they're going to feel my wrath. But that is one of the ways to just very quickly, on my perspective, of increasing in those two tactical ways. Other folks, as we're wrapping up, job descriptions or internships?
I thought I would jump in there because I jumped in a little bit late, but I'll try and go quick. On the reaching people with job descriptions and internships and things like that, in my most recent job search process, there was a lot of personal analysis around that particular question. And I think it might have been Slack or one of those companies that is a little bit newer and booming and focuses on diversity and inclusion. But they actually highlighted some of that within the actual job description and application, saying, you may feel like you're not qualified for this position, but the statistic of women will only apply to something if they're 100% qualified. Men will apply when they're like 80% qualified. They were highlighting some of those metrics within the actual job description and encouraging people to apply, even if they didn't necessarily meet all of the qualifications, which made me really want to apply, because I was like, this is a company that values people who are looking to grow. This is a company that values people that are willing to stretch themselves to become better. And so that was one of those things that I was looking through applications that stood out to me, is like a company that just flat out said it in the job description of, we're looking for these kind of people. And that's who we want on our team.
That's great. We are, oh, Dujon, do you want to say one more thing?
Yeah,
I want to, okay, go ahead.
I pinged in the chat. Textio is a great resource. It's data-driven text recommendations for job descriptions that a lot of corporations are using, like McDonald's, Elation, and a few other big Fortune 500 and then small, medium-sized brand that's helping organizations craft the right job descriptions. They've seen like 15, 30% increase in women applicants, people from underrepresented backgrounds by using the text recommendations for the jobs that they're posting out into the marketplace. So that's a quick tactical platform or resource that you all can look into among others that can help with that. Great. Well, Fadzi, Bruce, Dujon, thanks for joining us on this conversation. Everybody else, thanks for joining. I saw in the chat that there's evidently a virtual toast or happy hour after this. So click on over and keep colliding on at Venture Cafe. Thank you all.